What if, in the hush of a single cosmic moment, the Earth simply stopped? What if the motion we never hear, the turning we never feel, the steady whirling that has carried us since the beginning, fell still, like a great wheel without breath? The thought itself is unsettling, almost wrong, as though silence could drown the very structure of time. And yet, the question lingers, soft and irresistible. If the planet slipped out of its rhythm, what shape would life, memory, and the world itself take? We live inside motion without realizing it. Each day, each night, we ride atop a sphere spinning faster than sound, pulled in quiet arcs through space. Our atmosphere whirls with it, our oceans lean toward it, even the way rain falls and branches sway is touched by this hidden turn. To stop is not only to still the world, but to ripple through every layer of our existence. Not because the spin is separate from us, but because it is us. The air you breathe this very moment carries with it the imprint of Earth's rotation, the signature of a planet in constant, patient flight. Close your eyes and imagine it ending. The oceans, no longer balanced by the centrifugal breath, would begin to move. Water would surge away from the equator and rush toward the poles, drowning coastlines, swallowing plains, laying bare ancient seabeds that perhaps no human eye has ever seen. Cities would blur into silt, forests would vanish under grey-green waves, and whole continents would be re-sketched as if a careless hand had redrawn the map in water. And yet, beneath those floods, there would stir a memory, fossils once entombed, ruins once swallowed, histories once erased, emerging for a brief moment into the air again. And then the air itself. Atmosphere, once spiraling with Earth's turning, would no longer dance in careful swirls. Winds would move in straight, violent sighs, thundering across landscapes with a force beyond comparison. The sky above would not break into familiar storms, but into something alien, currents without curves, tempests without rhythm, motion without music. Perhaps the clouds would flatten into strange ribbons stretched endlessly across the horizon. Perhaps stillness itself would become unbearable, filling each breath with a tension we do not yet have words for. Time would change too, for in this sudden halt, the spinning that guides sunrise and sunset would vanish. One side of the planet would face endless light, never relinquishing its day. The other would fall into unbroken night, a sky dusted forever with stars no longer interrupted by dawn. Days and hours, so threadbare in their familiarity, would fracture into alien concepts. How would we measure the seasons if the rhythm of turning were gone? How would we dream if the sun never rose, or never set? Would memory itself begin to dissolve, unanchored from the cycle that once defined it? Gravity would grow heavier, not by much, but enough for all to notice. Our bodies would bend subtly under burdens once imperceptible. Rivers would settle into new beds, mountains would collapse by inches of weight. Even arteries, bones, and breath would feel their own substance thickening inside us, not because gravity grew stronger, but because the gentle outward push of Earth's spin had disappeared. A planet heavier, denser, almost solemn in its stillness, pressing into every movement we made. We know, from the stone record, that Earth has always spun. Ancient corals reveal days were once shorter, and Earth turning more swiftly in deep pasts. Fossilized shells carry quiet counts of nights, recording changes long before we arrived. But nowhere, in 500 million years of Earth's kept memory, is there silence. To stop would be to break not only the rhythm of our lives, but the entire geological song the planet has sung since its birth from molten dust. And so, the question lingers. If it truly happened, would we still be Earth as we know it, or would the planet transform into something new, something unrecognizable, carrying us between its ribs as part of its metamorphosis? Is it possible that such stillness would erase us, or would it, in an odd inversion, preserve us, encasing our cities as sudden fossils, capturing our artifacts in layers of silt and ash, freezing our civilizations in one moment of perfect geological pause? It is not only the science of loss that fills the mind, but the poetry of forgetting. What would it mean for a world whose living pulse was always motion, to find itself caught in eternal unmoving silence? Would time itself hesitate, or would it march forward regardless, leaving us to wither in a body that no longer turns? Perhaps memory is not stored only in stone, in bone, or in dust, but in the very spin that never ceases. If that were true, then perhaps to halt the Earth would be to erase even the possibility of remembrance. And yet, even as we linger in this imagining, we begin to realize if so much depends on spin, if so much could be lost in a single held breath, then perhaps we have not fully understood the thin threads that hold us here. If a moment of stillness can drown oceans, darken skies, and unmoor time itself, what else, hidden beneath us, might also slip away unnoticed? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? And yet, if this much can be lost, what else might we have forgotten? Perhaps one of the most curious truths is that we forget rotation itself. The earth turns endlessly, and yet we do not feel it. The ground beneath us seems so steady, so absolute, so permanent, that we take this quiet miracle as ordinary. But in truth, every wave, every cloud, every drifting branch outside your window is being shaped by a hidden hand. An unseen gesture, delicate but relentless, curves the very air and water around us. At the equator, the speed of this turning is astonishing, over 1,600 kilometers every hour, carrying entire continents along as though they were weightless cargo. Yet no dizziness, no lurching tilt greets us. We feel nothing of that rush. We sleep, we walk, we breathe, and all the while, our bodies, our oceans, our skies are carried in a rotation, so perfect it feels like stillness. This is the paradox. Motion so constant that it becomes invisible, speed so uniform that it feels like rest. Imagine a carousel, but one so vast that its edges blur into horizons. A carousel that does not stop, does not groan, does not creak, but turns with such patience that within it, silence feels natural. The Earth has done this since its beginning, since hot fragments of cosmic dust first clumped and began to spin, conserving the angular momentum of a collapsing nebula. That simple birthright, rotation, has become the unseen rhythm of land and sea, of clouds and climate, of every creature that walks in its embrace. Without this spin, the equator would not be the equator we know. The oceans would not bulge there, held outward by centrifugal breath. Instead, they would collapse toward the poles, pulling coastlines into new shapes. And even now, as Earth continues its steady turn, we live inside the bulge it creates, thousands of meters higher at the equator than at the poles, carved invisibly by rotation. The planet is not truly round, but a softened sphere, swollen by its own motion. Yet when we look upon it, we see perfection, never suspecting that it is leaning into spin at every moment. Even the atmosphere takes its cues. Winds curve because the ground beneath them moves. The Coriolis effect, named long after it was first felt, bends storms into spirals, turning hurricanes into vast gyres that mimic the very motion of the world itself. Without rotation, rain would fall differently. Rivers would run straighter, currents would not circle in great gyres across the seas. This hidden hand is everywhere, sculpting the unseen geometry of weather and water. We live inside its embrace without knowing. Consider, too, the moon. The tides rise and fall with its pull, but their rhythm is braided inseparably with Earth's turning. Twice daily the seas breathe on our coasts, not only because of lunar gravity, but because the ground spins beneath the bulging ocean. If the Earth stood still, tides would reshape entirely, more fixed, more frozen, less like breath, and more like wound. Perhaps then the sound of the sea, which has lulled us since the first creatures crept ashore, would no longer resemble a slow inhale and exhale, but become something strange, eternal, unmoving. Our bodies have synchronized to this spin in ways we still don't fully grasp. Circadian rhythms, carved into us by day and night, are echoes of Earth's rotation, our sleep, our waking, our pulses of energy, even the ways plants open and close their leaves. These are songs tied to a 24-hour cycle sculpted by turning. If that cycle stretched or froze, would we still feel like ourselves, or would identity itself feel loosened? A song played on the wrong instrument, recognizable but somehow alien. The story of rotation is not only of rhythm, but of decay. Each day grows longer over deep time. Fossils show ancient corals recording days, only 21 hours long, hundreds of millions of years ago, when Earth spun faster. Tidal friction with the moon slows us ever so gently, like a pendulum dragged by invisible fingers. Someday, billions of years from now, the Earth may become tidally locked, showing one face forever to the sun, as the moon shows only one to us. Rotation even now is slowing, fading, eroding, like a memory too vast to notice slipping away. And perhaps that is what makes it melancholy. For though we cannot hear it, cannot feel it, the spin is there, the hidden backdrop to every story we tell, every stone we uncover, every breath we take. Without it, time would lose its signature. Climates would wander into extremity. Oceans would turn restless. skies would flatten into unfamiliar silence, and yet we have lived so long inside this force that we no longer sense its gift. We mistake it for stillness, and perhaps that is humanity's great blindness, to forget the hand that holds us because it never lets go. So if the spin were to pause, even for a moment, it would not simply be the physical violence of oceans and winds that unmake us. It would be the unmooring of identity itself, a loss of the clock that ticked inside plants and animals alike, a loss of the curvature of wind, a loss of the Earth's own soft bulge. To stand on a non-spinning Earth is not simply to stand heavier, but to stand forgotten, as though the planet no longer remembers what it is. And so we find ourselves here, in awe of the invisible hand that carves the shape of rivers, clouds and days, a hand we will never hold, but one we rest within always, a reminder that motion defines us even when disguised as stillness. And yet, if rotation holds such secrets quietly, what other veiled powers lie beneath, waiting to be noticed only in their absence? And yet, if rotation holds such unseen power, we must ask, what would the oceans do if that power was taken away? For though the seas seem steady, they are not their own masters. They are balanced on the bulge of a turning Earth, lifted outward at the equator by the invisible hand of spin. Without that motion, without the outward push, the water would no longer stay in place. It would move, it would flood, it would drown. Imagine the first day of silence after the turning ended. From space, the planet would already look different. That gentle, rounded swell around Earth's waist, the equatorial bulge, would be gone. Oceans would begin to abandon the equator, like breath pulled inward, surging toward the poles where gravity is strongest, where spin no longer lends relief. Shorelines we know would vanish. The Pacific, the Atlantic, the Indian, they would spill like vast bowls tilting, pouring water across continents, reshaping the skin of the Earth in only days or weeks. The seas are heavy beyond imagining. Every cubic meter of water weighs a ton, and there are more than 1 billion trillion cubic meters of ocean covering our planet. Shift just a fraction, and coastlines drown. Shift them all, and the planet is rewritten. Warm cities become saltwater graveyards. Forests that stood for millennia are erased in a single sweeping tide. Inland deserts might remain dry, but once familiar harbors would no longer exist, their memories lost beneath waves. Perhaps only the tallest mountains would keep their heads above these rearranged waters. Perhaps oceans, in their restless migration, would carve new basins, new trenches, reshuffling the map of Earth as though erasing a chalkboard. But we must also wonder, in this drowning, what might rise. The ocean's hunger exposes as much as it devours. As new shorelines form, deep seafloors, once hidden for millions of years, would breathe sky for the first time. There, in silts layered over ages, would lie fossils of ancient creatures, ammonites, trilobites, corals of vanished reefs. Human artifacts buried beneath deltas might surface too. Port cities long swallowed by silt might wake again in this sudden upheaval, ruins caught between drowning and revelation. Could it be that a stopped Earth would return to us, things long stolen by water, exposing forgotten histories even as it erases new ones? Scientists speak of ocean subduction, where seafloors descend beneath continents, carrying sediments deep into Earth's mantle. Entire libraries of life descend into rock, folded and melted into the planet's hidden core. If water fled the equator, might we glimpse some of those buried archives before the Earth buried them again? Whole epochs could be revealed briefly, like half-remembered dreams resurfacing before fading once more. And yet, the catastrophe would not unfold quietly. As oceans surged poleward, their movement would thunder across landscapes. Waves kilometers high could sweep from coast to inland, dragging forests, soils and cities into their currents. Currents would clash, new tidal lines would carve into rock, and beneath the weight of so much moving water, the Earth's crust itself would groan. Pressure redistributed from equator to pole would rattle fault lines, mountains would quake, volcanic seams could tear open in fury. In this way, water is never only passive. It presses, crushes, and alters the bones of Earth itself. But however violent it sounds, pause to imagine it slowly, as if from afar, as if you were watching through eons. Oceans inch upward, along shorelines, year by year rising, year by year swallowing. Whole landscapes disappear, not in one day of panic, but in a long sigh of water creeping forward, drowning meadows, lapping at doorsteps, silencing each coastline in turn. The globe would come to wear new clothing. Strange seas draped where deserts once glittered, archipelagos forming where mountains had risen. In deep time, such changes are not extraordinary. They have happened many times, seas advancing and retreating, turning continents into archipelagos and back again. What seems like horror to us is only another verse in an ancient song the planet has always sung. Still, for us, the question would sting closer. What remains of memory when shorelines vanish? We anchor our civilizations to coasts, to rivers joining seas, to tides feeding fish and crops. If those foundations drown, would we still feel like ourselves? Or would our memory too dissolve into brine, replaced by the silence of absence? And perhaps here lies the deeper wonder. Oceans are not only water, but memory kept fluid. They carry dissolved fragments of everything they've touched, the ions of stone, the breath of volcanoes, the detritus of eons. Every tide is an archive. If rotation ceased, and oceans moved to new shelters, entire histories would be rearranged, recombined, rewritten in salt. Maybe the Earth itself would remember differently, carrying forward a narrative unlike the one we've known. Maybe memory, like water, is never fixed, only moving, reshaping, rewriting what is forgotten and what is found. And so we are left with a haunting image. A planet whose seas exhale in one great tide, rushing away from the equator, drowning some worlds while birthing new ones. Cities dissolve, fossils wake, shorelines vanish, myths are reborn. The oceans, like breath, torn from their resting place, inhale and exhale in new rhythms we would barely recognize. And yet, as the waters rearrange and memory pools in strange new basins, another question remains, softer but no less mysterious. If seas can remake the surface of the earth, what happens to the air we breathe, once the winds too lose their song? And yet, as the oceans find new homes, as shorelines surrender to water's unrelenting memory, we cannot help but look upward. For just as the seas are shaped by Earth's turning, so too are the skies. The air we breathe, the clouds that drift above us, the storms that cradle and break across lands, all are woven into spirals and curves by rotation. Without that turning hand, the sky itself would fall into strangeness, winds stripped of their song. Perhaps at first we would feel only a subtle imbalance, a disquiet we could not name. The breezes that once circled gently might move with a heaviness, less like a whispered breath and more like a blunt, rushing tide of air. For though we imagine wind as invisible freedom, its freedom is never careless. It is guided, bent, persuaded by the Coriolis effect, that quiet consequence of spin that arcs jet streams across continents and sculpts storms into vast, spiraling bodies. It is this curvature that makes the familiar swoop of a storm's eye, the elegant whirl of clouds glimpsed from orbit, the eternal dance of trade winds that have guided humans across oceans for millennia. Without rotation, that choreography vanishes. Winds would no longer arc, but cut in long, brutal strokes. Instead of swirling storms, we would face vast atmospheric floods, air rushing unstopped from hot zones to cold. The equator, bathed in endless sunlight in this motionless world, would bleed heat upward without reprieve, while the polar night would drink in unending cold. Between them, the air would tear fiercely, seeking balance it could never quite reach. Wind, once music, would become blunt force. Perhaps forests would bow as if before colossal, invisible walls. Perhaps sand and soil would lift into streams, entire deserts carried aloft not in dance but in grim procession. And yet, it is not only violence we must imagine, but absence. The whirling hum of planets, the quiet voice of storms twisting over seas, all would be gone. There would be no hurricane eyes, no spinning cyclones, no delicate curves traced into the clouds. Weather itself would become straight lines, heavy strokes across the canvas of the world. Would we notice the silence? Would the absence of curvature, the shapelessness of storms feel like a kind of grief? We are creatures who live inside rhythm, inside pattern. To lose the spiral might be to lose something of ourselves. Consider the jet streams. High above, rivers of wind cross the sky, steering weather from one continent to another. They are born from rotation, tightened and curved by speed. If the Earth stopped, these aerial rivers would not simply die, they would unravel. Weather would no longer drift in cycles, but crash in extremes. Heat would pool beneath the eternal day, towering clouds rising like walls of vapor, while cold would deepen beneath the permanent night. Skies drained of motion, frost spreading without reprieve. Between them, wind would howl in ceaseless straight lines, storms that stretch the length of continents. Night would not cool as it used to. Day would not soften at dusk. Each side of the earth would grow ever more alien. And in that alienation, perhaps life itself would falter. But in imagining this, we might ask, what are winds after all, if not breaths of the planet? The earth inhales and exhales through currents, the size of atmosphere born of temperature and spin. To silence rotation is to silence half this breath. Would the planet still feel alive if its winds no longer curled into song, or would it resemble a body whose lungs no longer expand, whose silence is broken only by the unsteady rasp of imbalance? From the perspective of deep time, winds have always sung. They carved canyons, sculpted dunes, drifted seeds across valleys and carried rains into soils. Entire ecosystems remember their touch. Fossil dunes whisper that the air once crossed deserts long drowned. Pollen trapped in sediments testifies to winds that once ferried life across continents. It is not only present creatures but entire ages that still breathe through wind. Without them, what memories would be lost, uncarried, undelivered, forgotten before they could take root? And yet, perhaps something stranger would emerge. A planet without curved winds might invent patterns we cannot easily picture, currents like ribbons snapping straight across the sky, storms stretched into endless traveling walls, air and dust migrating ceaselessly from day to night to day to night. Would such winds still carry the soft smell of rain? Would they still rattle leaves, stir oceans into waves, lull us at night through half-open windows? Or would the air itself feel foreign, vast and anonymous, no longer familiar as breath? The more we imagine these windless songs, the more it feels like a kind of erasure, not only of weather, but of identity. Storms and breezes are not just physical forces, they are part of our memory, part of how we sense and remember the world. To lose their curvature is to lose their voice. To watch the sky without spirals is to gaze into silence dressed as motion. And so, as the seas find new shapes and the skies fall back into blunt extremes, we realize rotation is not merely a force but a language, one spoken in waves and winds alike. Without it, Earth not only transforms but falls silent, stripped of the gentle spirals that once made it alive. And yet, if the very air could lose its song, what of the creatures who rely on its music? The birds, the migrations, the rivers themselves now deprived of this turning hand. And yet, if the winds lose their spiral, what happens to all that depends on their subtle curves. For the Coriolis effect is not only the parent of storms, but a hidden sculptor of rivers, migrations and journeys far older than our own. Without it, the earth becomes less asymmetrical, less alive with quiet deviations, and more blunt, more linear, more silent. Consider a river. Today, even the smallest stream listens to the turning of earth. Flowing water bends slightly to the right in the northern hemisphere, softly to the left in the southern. It is a nearly imperceptible persuasion, one we cannot see when gazing from a bridge, yet accumulate that effect over centuries. And rivers carve differently, channels drift, banks erode more on one side, deltas build with an unseen bias toward one shore. Without this whisper of curvature from the Coriolis, rivers would behave differently. They might run straighter, strike their paths less like arcs and more like blades through stone and soil. What landscapes would vanish if rivers no longer danced but marched? In skies and seas, the same quiet guidance exists. Hurricanes spin into being because air is bent. Oceans swirl into gyres because rotation insists upon it. But without those bends, balance itself becomes strange. Oceanic life depends on upwellings, currents that rise, spiraling nutrients from the deep into sunlight. Without spin, those upwellings falter, starving plankton, unraveling the food webs they sustain. The seas that first gave us life may fall silent, not because they lack water, but because the Coriolis, the hidden conductor, has dropped its baton. Life above water feels the silence too. Birds trace their migrations not only by stars but by winds sculpted into predictable pathways. Monarch butterflies lean into breezes, whales align with currents, even spores and seeds depend on subtle air spirals that scatter them across landscapes. Without the Coriolis, migrations could lose direction, scattered not in arcs but in chaos, their careful patterns unraveling. Perhaps flocks would search skies that no longer guide them, rivers no longer nourishing them, skies no longer spiraling around them. Perhaps extinction would become not a moment of catastrophe, but an unspooling of navigation, a dissolving map unraveling quietly within generations. It is in this sense that silence becomes most haunting. For the Coriolis was never something we could hear, never something we could touch, and yet it has been present in the shape of every storm, in the bent path of every river, in the very dance of herds and migrations. Remove it, and we are left with movements that feel emptier, as though the world has lost its accent, its particular lilt, its subtle inflection. A language stripped of consonants still survives, but it is quieter, flatter, robbed of its music. Science reminds us that the earth has always been shaped by asymmetry. Perfection is stillness, linearity, balance, but asymmetry, that leaning spiral, that hidden deflection, is what creates the richness of motion. Without it, the planet feels less like a body in motion and more like a mechanical sphere, blank in its repetitions. Asymmetry gave us variation, difference, texture. The Coriolis effect, silent to our senses, granted rivers their curves, storms their whirl, and migrations their memories. Its loss is not only physical, but existential. Would we notice it, truly? On the surface, perhaps only the absence of storms, the strangeness of rivers, the faltering of migrations would greet us. But something deeper would ache, for we are creatures of pattern, and when patterns dissolve, we feel it like hunger or like grief. Would we sense in the background of days that something quiet but essential had gone missing? Would we feel that the skies were no longer alive, or that rivers, though still flowing, no longer carried the same secret pulse? Perhaps the silence of the Coriolis would not roar, would not destroy in explosions or crashes. Perhaps it would fade in like dusk, softly, each year a little flatter, each river a little straighter, each migration a little less certain, until one day the earth still looked alive, but it no longer breathed as it once did. And yet, as rivers lose their dance and skies their spirals, another question gathers softly at the edges. What happens not only to motions but to time itself, when the earth's rotation ceases to mark its passing? And yet, as rivers lose their bends and skies their spirals, we arrive at a more intimate rift, the unraveling of time itself. For what is a day, if not the turning of the earth beneath the sun? What is a night, if not the leaning away from its light? Without rotation, these cycles, etched into every root and heartbeat, would shatter. Hours would stretch into eternities. The very fabric of rhythm, the passage we call living, would stagger and fracture. Imagine standing in the eternal noon of a land where the sun no longer moves. Shadows frozen, deserts, growing hotter by each breath, until soil cracks into mirrored plains of dust. There would be no dusk, no cool relief, no promise that darkness waits just beyond the edge of horizon. Instead, light would grow monstrous in its constancy. Plants adapted to retreat under night would wither. Crops that once leaned toward the journeying sun would twist in confusion, reaching endlessly, never resting. Perhaps new forms of life would emerge, leaves armoring themselves against fire, blossoms that bloom only to close forever. But the creatures shaped by turning, creatures shaped by the sun's rise and fall, would struggle to remember what rest once meant. On the far side of the planet, another eternity would bloom, endless night. Here, ice and cold would creep unbroken, binding forests in frozen stillness, locking grasslands beneath drifts without thaw or spring. Starlight would dominate. The Milky Way would sweep across the heavens not in fleeting glimpses, but as a permanent river of silver, unmoving in its vast arc. One half of the planet would live beneath a sun that forgot how to leave, the other half beneath stars that never look away. Everywhere, time as we know it would vanish. And what then, of us? For we are born from cycles. Circadian rhythms are not copies. They are identities, kept in cells, pulsing in molecules, etched even into our DNA. To live without day and night would unravel our sense of time. The body might cling to its ancient clock, a faint echo of rotation still carved within us, but drifting unanchored in endless day, or drowning in seasonless night, the clock would falter. Perhaps days or months would feel alike. Perhaps sleep would come in strange fragments, untethered, a whispering confusion between dream and waking. Without rotation, even memory itself might lose its order. The geologic record tells us the length of days has always mattered. Fossil corals, with their delicate growth lines, reveal that Earth once spun faster. Days were shorter, life moved in quicker rhythms. Trees, too, carry memory in their rings, marking growth against the march of seasons. Life bends not only to light but to its movement, to shadows' return, to the knowledge that endings always lead to beginnings. Without that turning, without dawn promised by dusk, would we begin to lose not just rhythm but hope? On the eternal day side, deserts would grow unspeakably vast. Oceans, exposed to unyielding sun, would steam into the sky, clouds rising like endless pillars. Without rotation to spread them, storms would linger unbroken, as if nailed into great still arcs. Monsoons might reach but never retreat. Rain might fall not in patterns, but as permanent curtains drawn across regions, while elsewhere, the soil dries into lifeless husks. To live here is to live in repetition, patterns without change, eternities without escape. Meanwhile, in endless night, glaciers would stretch as though seeking to cover the world, breath crystallizing into winds that never warmed, seas stiffening into slabs of silence. Polar landscapes would no longer migrate seasonally, they would simply claim half the earth forever. Perhaps some species would cling to volcanic warmth, glowing bacteria trapped in ice, or creatures evolving to live by starlight, hunting in worlds where the sun has become only rumor. But human life, the fragile balance of our farms, our shelters, our traditions would wither in such unevenness. But wonder too, for what if, in the endless night, we found new beauty? A sky unchanging might teach us patience. Constellations unmoved would feel like carved stone above our heads, their stories no longer fleeting but permanent. Whole generations might live under the gaze of the same stars. Maybe memory itself would become less of a stream and more of a pool, still reflections deepened by permanence. And in eternal day, perhaps light would feel less forgiving but more holy, a furnace that made life see itself with sharper clarity. Is there meaning, we might ask, in constancy itself, even when it threatens survival? The idea of hours becoming eternities feels unbearable now, but life adapts. It always has. Perhaps humans could build along twilight's edge, where eternal dusk blurs between light and dark, that narrow ring around the motionless planet. A place where sun hovers forever on the horizon might become a refuge. There, the light would never rise higher, never fall lower, but linger in perpetual amber glow. A world balanced on the line between fire and ice, where day and night negotiate in silence. It is easy to picture cities there, clinging to dim equilibrium, streets bathed in sunset that never fades. A fragile boundary between extremes, written into stone, water, and breath. Still, the deeper question remains. What would time mean to us in such a world? Without sunrise, without sunset, there are no days to count, no cycles to hold on to, no measure for longing or memory. Perhaps, in that absence, eternity would feel less like infinity, and more like a prison, unchanging light, unchanging night, identity stretched until it frays. Or, perhaps eternity could feel like release, finally free from the ticking hands of a clock, from the rotations we once mistook as permanent. Hours becoming eternities would change not just the planet, but the way we think of ourselves. We would no longer define life by mornings or evenings, by beginnings or ends. We would have to find new rhythms, new patterns, new songs beyond the loss of turning. But if such endlessness reshapes time, it will surely reshape us. And yet, if light and shadow can last forever, unbroken, what happens to the gravity we thought we knew, the heaviness that presses us here, even as the spin once lifted us away? And yet, if time itself unravels beneath eternities of day and night, another truth begins to press gently upon us. Without rotation, the earth would weigh more heavily upon everything it holds. For while gravity tethers us here, the planet's spin has always given us a slight reprieve, an outward push so constant we have never known to name it. Without that spin, the relief is gone, and suddenly every stone, every step, every breath becomes heavier. The change would be quiet, almost invisible at first. You would not wake to find yourself crushed. You might not even notice it consciously, yet subtly, unmistakably, your weight would grow. Standing, you would feel your feet pressed firmer into the soil. Climbing a step, your legs would tire faster, not because gravity itself had changed, but because the counterforce once flung outward by Earth's rotation had ceased. At the equator, where that centrifugal breath was greatest, the difference would be strongest. The Earth beneath your body, once giving slightly, would now hold you closer, more insistently. Geologists remind us that this outward spin has shaped the very body of the Earth. The equator bulges outward, swollen by motion, making our planet not a perfect sphere, but an oblate world, soft-bellied around its waist. Without spin, the bulge would slowly relax inward. Stone by stone, mountain by mountain, the crust itself would settle, as if the Earth were sighing into its most compact shape. But this settling would create violence. Earthquakes would ripple, as planetary weight redistributed, cliffs collapsing, valleys imploding inward. It would not be a sudden shattering, but a gradual groan, a rearranging of every contour we have known. And we, too, would groan. The human skeleton is a balance of strength and lightness, tuned to the push and pull of our planet's constant state. Animals, trees, rivers, each evolved under the gentle cheat of centrifugal release. Remove it, and life is heavier than it remembers. Perhaps our spines would compress over decades, shrinking us subtly. Perhaps our hearts would strain against higher internal pressure, blood feeling denser as it rises within us. Even breath would cost more work, chest lifting against a sky that now presses imperceptibly harder. To be alive, even in stillness, would be to labor ever so slightly more. But with heaviness comes forgetting, for it is easy to overlook how much of what we love relies on lightness. Dust that swirls in sunbeams, the drifting of birds, clouds curling into fragile towers, each is carved by the balance of gravity and rotation. Without spin, dust settles more stubbornly, clouds pile differently, wings strain harder, earth grows less airy, more solemn. Playfulness itself begins to feel diminished. Gravity presses everything downward, as though the planet is less inclined to let anything drift free. And still, there would be beauty in the weight. In mountains bowed inward, we might find hidden stone veins revealed as crusts resettle. The earth, tightening around us, might exhale minerals long buried, reshaping soil and rock, and perhaps granting rise to new terrains waiting to be discovered. In heaviness, the earth could show us parts of itself long hidden. Weight not only crushes, it also reveals. Yet, as we imagine this thicker heaviness pressing into rivers, forests and cities, we cannot avoid the deeper reflection how much of our identity rests on weightlessness we never recognized before. We remember freedom as lightness, children leaping, seeds drifting, balloons rising as though in laughter. Without spin, gravity claims more of that freedom. Would we begin to dream differently, imagine differently, desire differently, under skies where everything feels more firmly nailed to the ground? Is it possible, too, that our memory of time itself would alter beneath this new press? For every heartbeat, every gesture, would take more effort, and what once felt like quickness might feel laborious. Perhaps gravity ties not only our bodies, but our sense of pace. In heaviness, does time feel slower, or simply more deliberate? It is here that we must pause. For there is a fragile thread between weight and remembrance. Stones keep records through isotopes. Fossils hold patterns through time. Every archive of the earth is, in some sense, a record of gravity imprinting itself. Without spin, that record becomes subtly different, denser, altered, heavier in meaning as well as matter. Perhaps civilizations that came after, if any endured, would find our ruins pressed more firmly into stone, our artifacts fossilized in a way more absolute, a memory harder to erase, because weight itself carved it deeper. And yet, this is only one chapter in the stillness. For even as the body grows heavier, storms shift and seas rearrange, there is another kind of archaeology waiting beneath the floods and the weight, with water rushing into new basins and gravity pressing harder upon continents. Perhaps ruins themselves, civilizations washed away once before, might rise again into fragile daylight, returning to remind us of what has already been lost. And yet, if the world grows heavier, if the seas flood and retreat, if mountains groan and rivers march in new silence, what then rises from beneath? For each transformation does not only erase, it also uncovers. The earth is both a destroyer and an archivist, burying civilizations and epochs beneath water, sand and stone, only to reveal them again when the rhythms shift. A motionless planet would become a restless archaeologist, turning its surface inside out, and forcing the forgotten to breathe again. Imagine a coastline swallowed centuries ago. A city, once vibrant, reduced to drowned outlines beneath sediment and tide. With rotation gone and the oceans rushing poleward, such drowned places might suddenly stand exposed. Streets slick with clays hardened over ages, stone foundations catching sunlight for the first time in millennia, mosaics of forgotten gods, shimmering faintly, their colors muted, yet still defiant. They would not rise triumphantly, they would emerge hesitantly, like ghosts. Places erased from memory, made solid again, reminding us that the earth never forgets entirely. And not only cities, entire landscapes carry their own ruins, lives not built by humans, but carved by water, bone, and silence. Fossil beds locked deep beneath seafloor sediment might re-emerge when tides shift. Trilobites, ammonites, ancient corals, all hints of oceans that have vanished long before our own. In their delicate spiraling shells and ridged bodies lies a memory of seas older than continents, storms older than mountains. To reveal them again would be to braid timelines, a silent night creature of 400 million years ago waking alongside a drowned city of 1,000 years ago, both testaments, side by side in the new geography of a halted Earth. Sand is often thought of as emptiness, as grit, as nuisance. But in truth, sand is memory. It is the final whisper of stone eroded by wind and wave. It is old mountains ground into powder, carried across deserts, laid into dunes. Beneath these shifting seas, dunes may crumble and reform, spilling out forgotten histories trapped within. Perhaps statues, pyramids, and vessels would wake again from beneath their sheaths of shifting grains, a reminder that civilizations too are sediment, destined to be carried forward like dust. Geology teaches us, this cycle has no morals, no intention. Continents drown, deserts bloom, seas retreat, because water and stone obey forces beyond our grasp. Yet from this indifference, we catch brief mercy. Fragments of preservation, whole Pompeiis of our species, lie waiting still, waiting for the right drought, the right tide, the right shift of Earth's skin to reveal them. A frozen mammoth blinking from melting ice, a sunken harbor dragged forward by the sea's restless hand, a mural painted in pigment that the Earth has hidden and guarded in darkness for 2,000 years. And if rotation stopped, and such transformations arrived not over millennia but within the lifetime of a generation, imagine how many new fragments would return to us. Imagine walking along a new shoreline revealed by oceans fleeing equatorial bulges and finding fossils etched like hieroglyphs into the rock, ruins scattered like puzzle pieces in the sand. Perhaps the memory of species erased in past extinctions would mingle with the memory of cultures erased in wars, floods, or famine. A single page of stone inscribed in multiple tongues, geological, biological, human, all of them speaking at once. Yet, this revelation is not gentle. For every ruin unearthed, new ruins are created. Our cities, heavier, now under new gravity, cracked and tilted by shifting plates, would themselves begin to fossilize. Concrete buckling, steel rusting, glass fracturing into sands of its own. Future eyes, if such eyes remain, would see us in fragments, barely comprehensible, filed beside trilobites, beside ammonites, beside the faint graphite sketch of a child's name, scratched into a wall before it drowned. The Earth's memory mixes everything together with no privilege of order. Forgotten gods, forgotten names, forgotten shells, all one archive inked in stone. This is the strange paradox. To stop spinning is to erase, but also to remind. It is to flood present cities, even as it exhumes buried ones. It is to silence winds and seasonality, even as it whispers back the stories of oceans that once swelled and withdrew. Perhaps the halted Earth would be strewn with ghosts, half ruined, half revealed, memories stumbling into daylight before vanishing again, into weight, erosion, and water. And in this haunting mosaic, the concept of a lost civilization grows less fantastical. For how many times has Earth drifted its landscapes in ways that could erase even our deepest marks? We do not know what memories keep beneath the crust, what languages lie fossilized in silence, what histories dissolve in brine. Could it be that we too are not the first to rise, nor the first to vanish? Could the sand itself be holding stories more complex than fossils, marks of intelligence we have not yet dared to recognize? But perhaps the more unsettling question is not whether Earth reveals or forgets, but how it chooses what to return. For to live beside the ruins of our ancestors, while watching the waters take our own, is to live inside a mirror, every drowned city reflecting the one we are building, every fossil echoing our fragility. The still Earth becomes a graveyard and a gallery, a place where memory and forgetting collide with each tide. And so, as seas expose ruins and press fresh history back into stone, we cannot help but see ourselves tangled in the archive. If this halt reveals so much that is lost, then perhaps loss is never forever. Or perhaps it is. Perhaps exposure is nothing more than a passing glimpse, a tease before Earth's heavier silence claims it all again. For just as ruins rise, they crumble again. Just as stone speaks, it erodes. Just as sand unveils, it buries anew. And yet, if ruins can speak when oceans slip away, what deeper echoes slumber still in the older silence of the Earth, waiting in layers beneath our feet? And yet, if ruins may return and vanish again, if stones can speak for a fleeting moment before erosion silences them once more, we begin to sense there is a deeper voice beneath it all. For Earth's memory is not only shallow, not only written in sand or cities, it is written in deep time, time that does not count in centuries or millennia, but in millions, even billions of years. A record so slow it appears frozen, a language of stone, isotopes, and silence. Our own histories reach back only a few thousand years, yet beneath our feet lie strata that whisper of oceans that preceded continents, mountains that rose and fell before animals drew breath, climates that swung between extremes colder than ice and hotter than fire. Within every cliff face and canyon, within every folded ridge of stone, the earth has left echoes of what it has endured. We touch the walls of a gorge, and we touch, not the present, but a vanished world. Grain by grain, the archives of geology turn silence into testimony. Fossils are one kind of echo. The spiraled shells of ammonites, pressed into limestone like fingerprints, cry out from oceans that vanished hundreds of millions of years ago. Ferns etched with delicate veins into shale recall humid forests, suffocated long before the flowering plants we know today. And even older than these, in rocks deep and dark, lie the faintest impressions of the first microbial mats, whispering that life began not in chaos, but in small communities of persistence. Deep time holds these lives carefully, as though Earth itself refuses complete erasure. But what makes these echoes uncanny is not only their survival, but their incompleteness. For every fossil preserved, countless others dissolved, every bit of bone crushed into sediment, every leaf decayed to nothing. The silences between the echoes are more vast than the voices themselves. We do not know how many histories were lost, how many species left no trace at all. Deep time is as much about forgetting as it is about remembering. Its voice is broken, stammering, partial, and yet perhaps that brokenness is itself a form of poetry. The pauses between words that make the few syllables left all the more profound. And stone itself, without fossils, speaks. The layering of strata tells of ancient seas returning and retreating in patient cycles. Tilts and folds record the grinding of continents, colliding like drifting rafts on molten seas. Isotopes, faint in their decay, tell us how long ago lava cooled, or how swiftly ancient rivers carried silt across plain. Even within minerals, time sleeps, uranium slowly turning into lead, at rates so regular they become clocks for measuring the immeasurable. Rocks are not mute. They are journals written not in lines of ink, but in layers of weight, color, and age. To imagine the earth without spinning is to ask not only what happens to seas and skies, but what happens to this record itself. If the crust grows heavier, if shorelines flood and crack, new layers will be written. Cities drowned in salt water will fossilize beside the bones of fish, creating strange symphonies of human and non-human memory. Highways may harden into pale streaks of stone, skyscrapers may collapse into compressed seams, plastics and metals may form strange new minerals. This too would be absorbed into deep time, a new echo carved into silence, awaiting some future reader. But could deep time also echo things we no longer believe possible? Could its silences be hiding traces of civilizations older than we imagine? We think ourselves singular, but have we not already seen the earth erase with ruthless efficiency? Volcanoes, glaciers, tectonics, all conspire against permanence. Perhaps entire chapters have dissolved with no fossil, no stone, no signal but entropy itself. Deep time is vast enough to hold not just what we know, but entire worlds we have forgotten to ask about. And the still earth, with its sudden upheavals, might expose fragments we could not have dreamed of. This endless conversation between remembering and forgetting bends us inward too, because in deep time, even we are echoes waiting to fade. Our languages, our names, our brief century of machines, all are vanishing notes in a choir of stone. To stand before cliffs a billion years old is to realize our place is closer to silence than to speech. We are temporary listeners, walking for a moment through halls of geological memory that will close again long after we are gone. And yet, in that realization, something tender emerges. For even if most is lost, even if countless histories dissolved before memory could hold them, the few that remain, fossils, sediments, isotopes, remind us that silence is not absolute. The earth does not keep everything, but it chooses fragments, and in those fragments we are allowed to glimpse eternity. Perhaps that is enough, to know that we are woven, however briefly, into a memory larger than ourselves, an echo stretched across deep time. And still, as we lean into the vastness of geological silence, we find ourselves wondering about the subtle markers we leave behind. For if rocks can speak, and fossils can whisper, what archives are being written beneath us now, in this very moment's stillness, archives not of ancient seas or creatures, but of our own brief age, pressed invisibly into the future earth. And still as we wonder about echoes stretched across billions of years, our gaze falls downward to the soil beneath our feet, the bedrock beneath the soil, the sediment beneath the bedrock. For though cliffs and mountains reveal fragments of Earth's long story, the true archive lies hidden below us, recorded grain by grain, atom by atom, quietly layering even now. We walk upon a library we rarely pause to read. Each footprint we press into ground is fleeting. Rain washes, winds scatter, roots reclaim, yet deeper down, beyond the restless surface, time settles. Rivers lay down sediments that compress into stone, lakes entomb pollen, spores, seeds in dark anoxia, keeping them safe for tens of thousands of years. Volcanic eruptions bury forests in ash, preserving trunks, leaves, even the breath of a moment caught in minerals and frozen. Earth never writes like we do, with ink and paper. Its writing is longer, slower, made from burial, weight, and pressure. And yet, within this subterranean archive, astonishing details endure. Isotopes act as secret markers, tiny clocks ticking away in the dark. The ratio of carbon-14 in ancient wood, the tilt of oxygen isotopes in ice, the decay of uranium into lead. All of these numbers whisper back to us how long something has slept. With them, geologists can rewind the clock, glimpsing climates, extinctions and eras that ended long before our own. In these grains we read the history not just of Earth as an object, but of Earth as memory, memory written differently, more slowly, but memory all the same. Corals, for example, tell time. Layer upon layer of their skeletons mark each day and each season like rings of trees. Ancient fossil corals show us Earth once turned faster. Days were shorter, the planet spun more swiftly, the moon nearer. Even now, our archives confirm the gradual drag of tidal friction slowing the Earth, lengthening our days second by second, century by century. The archive beneath us does not only record what has been, it also speaks to what is still changing. It is as if the Earth itself keeps a journal written in coral limestone, in glacial ice, in deep ocean mud. And within this journal, we too are inscribed. Our species has burned forests, scattered metals, spread plastics, altered chemicals. These changes do not stay on the surface. Dust carries our residues into oceans, rivers carry ash into seas, winds drop particles across polar snows. Within just a few centuries, a geologist digging far into the future might pull up a core and see the sharp line of our presence. Lead from our fuels, radionuclides from our tests, plastics softened but enduring as strange, glittering fossils of consumption. This too is part of the archive, our layer, written in a language we did not mean to carve. There is humility in this realization. For the Earth forgets much, but it forgets slowly. Sand dunes collapse, seas retreat, forests vanish, yet beneath these losses traces remain. The ground beneath us is not empty, it is crowded with whispers of what has been lived, grown, built, and broken upon its surface. Even now, beneath a quiet meadow or a city street, there lie layers of what came before, seashells formed when oceans slept here, bones of animals we no longer know, charcoal from fires burned by lightning long before humans arrived. Every place, every step, contains a palimpsest of worlds erased. And here, speculation threads itself into wonder. If the Earth one day falls still, if the oceans flee equators and night claims half the world, what record will be written then? Which sediments will harden into stone? Which artifacts buried beneath floods will endure? Perhaps skyscrapers will blur into compressed strata, highways into long mineral lines, our technologies fossilized as crystalline seams. Perhaps what is most human in us will not be our cities or machines, but the sudden shift itself, this line in stone where the planet's spin ceased, a scar written deep enough to be found long after we are gone. The archive beneath our feet is not finished, not fixed. It is always being rewritten. Soil building, rivers carving, ash falling, dust settling, and in its pages lies a paradox. What survives is not what we intend, not what we choose, but what chance allows. A letter we held most dear may dissolve into mulch, while a careless shard of pottery or scrap of plastic becomes eternal in stone. The Earth curates not with meaning, but with weight, chemistry, and accident. We live briefly above this archive, making our marks and forgetting them almost as soon as they are made. But what lies beneath does not forget so quickly. It slows time, holds fragments, carries whispers forward, and yet, even this doesn't last forever. For stone itself erodes, layers fold, mountains melt into magma, archives too are erased and rewritten. Nothing holds forever. Memory, like matter, participates in entropy. But in the forgetting, new stories are always born. Perhaps this is what makes the stillness of a stopped Earth so haunting. It is not only a change in motion, but a sudden violent rewriting of this archive. And as we imagine this heavier, slower planet, stacking its sediments in different shapes, we are left to wonder if the Earth remembers this much. What more might entropy itself demand to keep or to erase? And yet, if the archive beneath our feet is always reshaped, if nothing is meant to endure untouched, we must speak of the quiet agent behind it all, the force that ensures no pattern remains unaltered, no structure perfectly preserved: entropy. The spread of energy, the soft dissolving of order into disorder, the whisper that drifts from every atom we know. It is entropy that erodes, entropy that disperses, entropy that levels the varied into the uniform, and strangely it is entropy too, that records. Without Earth's spin, entropy would accelerate its presence in our lives. The balance once upheld by rotation, daily temperature shifts, seasonal reliefs, the regular stirring of oceans and winds would collapse. Energy would no longer distribute itself gently across the planet. It would spill unevenly, in fever and frost. The day side would draw entropy close in growing heat, molecules scattering faster and faster until cohesion falters. The night side, shivering in endless cold, would drift toward uniform stillness, atoms slowing into crystalline quiet. Between them lies entropy's paradox, ceaseless spreading, yet always toward rest. Entropy is often spoken of as an enemy: heat, death, decay, corruption of memory. But perhaps it is better imagined as a keeper, not to preserve perfectly, not to guard intact, but to ensure that nothing holds its shape too long. A coral skeleton falls, a city crumbles, even the Earth itself slows, not because something has failed, but because the second law insists that what is concentrated must scatter, what is ordered must relax. It is not malice, it is patience. The slowest patience we will ever know. And when Earth ceases to spin, entropy becomes almost visible. Buildings will not fall in a day, but the pressure of new gravity, the rush of redistributed oceans, the stagnation of air will hasten subtle collapse. Metals expand with heat on the sunlit face, contract and crack in the endless ice of the dark side. Concrete will craze and flake as temperatures stretch it beyond memory. Cars rust into orange shadow, plastics blur into softened stones. All of it, piece by fragile piece, translated from one form into another. This too becomes part of Earth's new archive. Entropy engraving stillness into matter, one gentle disassembly at a time. But science also hints that entropy is what gives us time at all. Without disorder increasing, the arrow of time would dissolve. We count the past as that which has become less ordered, the future as that which still holds structure waiting to fall. Entropy does not just erode, it defines. It gives us a sense of before and after. The reason we cannot simply reverse the film of our lives and walk backward into memory. If rotation halts, and the rhythms of day and night dissolve, perhaps entropy would become our last true clock. In the absence of spinning, in the absence of seasons, we would still know time by watching things decay. And yet, decay carries its own kind of preservation. The ashes of forests feed the soil, the collapse of bones enriches the ground. Even in memory we find that what vanishes often leaves behind echoes that shape what follows. One civilization falls, and another grows in its ruins, borrowing stones, reshaping myths. Entropy erases, but it also transfers. Perhaps the keeper's secret gift is not in holding history the way it was, but in breaking it down so it can circulate again. Not permanence, but continuity. If Earth stood still, if its face toward the sun burned slowly into desert, and its far side froze into glass, entropy would carve those landscapes into testimony. Rocks would split under thermal stress. Ice would grind what lay beneath it. Dust, freed from wind spirals, would still settle in patterns too enormous for us to grasp. Every fragment would be scattered into new meaning. Entropy would not pause with Earth's pause. It would only change its tone. Philosophers remind us that even memory in the mind obeys this principle. Experiences fade, details blur, identities themselves are not permanent structures but processes of forgetting and recomposition. In this way, entropy is also at work in us, demanding not that we lose everything, but that we let it weather, shift, soften. We confuse this with weakness, but perhaps it is the only way to carry life forward. Were memory too rigid, it would become unbearable. Entropy relieves us of eternal sharpness. It allows us to forget enough that we can live again. So if Earth one day surrenders its spin, we would not only see oceans rush and climates fracture, we would be watching entropy in its purest expression, worlds moving not towards sudden ruin, but toward a wider, slower stillness. Disorder carried outward, scattering into permanence we cannot reverse. A planet stripped of its spirals still obeys the law of loss, and in obeying still breathes meaning. And perhaps the most humbling thought is that entropy itself requires no witness. Whether or not we are here to observe the spread, the fading, the scattering, it continues. Order dissolves into dust, silence stretches across space. The keeper remains, patient and unseen. And yet, if entropy is the final language of everything, of stars, of planets, of memory, what then of the fragile traces we leave? Could even they, scattered by entropy, persist as a strange new layer, our technofossils, our plastics, our satellites, incorruptible, not in defiance, but as another expression of scattering into new forms? And yet, if entropy is the great dissolver, always scattering, always softening, what fragments of us might remain in the still earth? We know stone endures longest, fossils last for millions of years by chance of burial and mineralization. But what of us? Not merely our bones but our machines, our metals, our plastics, our marks etched into matter, not born from seashells and forests, but from fuel and fire. This is where the question of technofossils begins. Already we have scattered this planet with traces too durable to forget quickly. Plastics drift in oceans as microfragments, finding their way into the bellies of fish, the wings of birds, the sediments of the most remote lakes. Concrete, stronger than many natural stones, encases landscapes in geometric order. Steel, though it rusts, leaves behind unusual mineral traces, alloys never formed by volcano or river, and glass, melted sand, may long outlive the hands that shaped it. These are our signatures, quiet, durable, and deeply unnatural. If Earth were to stop spinning, the upheaval of seas and skies would only intensify this fossilization. Cities drowned would quickly be buried in muds and salts, their steel and plastic pressed down into new strata. Highways would become dark mineral lines in the crust. Plastics would condense under weight and time, transforming into exotic rocks. Geologists already call them plastiglomerates, hybrid stones born of fire pits, where plastic melted into sand and coral. In future ages, such technofossils might be as common in the record as trilobites were in their own. And imagine this. A geologist of some distant epoch, perhaps human, perhaps other, raises a fragment from a long-dead ocean floor. Within it lies the fossilized shell of a mollusk, alongside a shard of polymer, once part of a bottle or a comb. The two fused together, indistinguishable in geologic age, their timelines wound so tightly they can no longer be separated. In this way, entropy does not erase us, but marries us to the planet, binding organic and synthetic into single stones. This possibility unsettles. For when we picture fossils, we imagine them as natural bones, teeth, plants pressed into rock. But already, even now, Earth is recording our artifacts as though they were its own children. Our machines, too, are sediment. Our concrete pillars, too, will be mudstone given enough centuries. The techno-fossil question is not if, but how much of our world will survive, and how alien will it appear to distant eyes. We can speculate further. Satellites, our shrapnel in orbit, may drift down to Earth eventually, burning or falling, leaving residues across global soils. Their fragments, mixed with rock and ice, could form rare alloys unique to this thin slice of Earth's time. Nuclear isotopes released in tests and disasters already mark a global stratum visible in sediments across the oceans. Even without catastrophe, our fingerprint is written everywhere, in lead, in mercury, in carbon itself. The Anthropocene, a word scientists now debate, rests not on philosophy, but on geology. We have already entered the record. And perhaps that is the strange irony. The halt of Earth's spin would erase us in floods, storms, and freeze, but it would also preserve us, our ruins sinking into layers, our plastics transformed into semi-eternal ghosts, our isotopes ticking like metronomes in the crust. Could it be that in death, we become more permanent than in life? Could it be that our most enduring legacy is not the stories we tell, but the altered chemistry of oceans, the hardened seams of concrete, the scatter of artifacts fossilized in strata? And what then will future memory make of us? If a mind one day reads the rocks of this halted planet, will it see us as strange animals, or as a geological force itself, no different than volcanoes or glaciers? Will they mistake our cities for reefs, our plastics for shells, our alloys for natural inventions, or will they see enough to grasp that Earth, for one fragile sliver of its time, bore a species whose restlessness was written into stone? There is humility hidden here. For technofossils, unlike our books or our machines in working order, carry no voice, no explanation, they will stand mute. A layer of concrete does not explain itself. A seam of radionuclides does not tell its story. Interpretation becomes guesswork. In this way, our longest memory becomes our most silent, our artifacts stripped of language, voices dissolved to echo. Entropy, the keeper, allows us to remain, but not in the form we imagined. And so, as we walk upon the earth that spins for now, but someday may silence its motion, we understand this paradox. The very forces that will erase us are also the ones that will ensure that traces of us remain. Entropy does not hate us. It enfolds us, carries us forward, transforms us into part of a larger script the earth is writing. And yet, as we accept this quiet permanence of technofossils, another thought shimmers just beyond reach. If seas can hold memory and stone can carry echoes, how much of the earth itself might act as a memory organ, an ocean of recollection larger than anything we can fathom? And yet, if technofossils whisper of what we leave for stone to remember, what of the waters that never rest? For the seas, too, record. They are not static archives, layered quietly and forgotten. They are memory in motion, carrying forward the dissolved fragments of everything Earth has endured. The oceans are memory pools, shaping and reshaping stories in salt and current, keeping what cannot be written anywhere else. Consider the chemistry of oceans. Every river carries its cargo of minerals, washing fragments of mountain and forest into the basin of the world. Sodium, magnesium, calcium, potassium, all gather in brines and stay. Volcanoes cough their ash into the sky, rains pull it down, and the ocean holds it. Even the air itself contributes, carbon drawn from our breathing, dissolved into wave and tide. And though water circulates, though molecules travel from surface to depth and back again, the pool remembers. The balance of salt and trace elements is nothing less than the continuous chronicle of Earth's surface, recorded not in pages or stone, but in liquid permanence. In ice cores we read the frozen oceans of the past, but even in liquid form the seas speak. Isotopes of oxygen and carbon echo past climates, warmings and coolings written in their ratios. The skeletons of plankton build in layers upon ocean floors, narrating thousands of years of surface temperature in their chemical makeup. A single drop can tell you where rains have fallen, where deserts have dusted their loads, where volcanoes have stirred. Oceans hold memory in dispersal, dissolving stories until they become inseparable from the whole body of water. In them, memory is not linear but fluid, mixing, scattering, carried like whispers across hemispheres. And this memory does not belong only to geology. Life itself is written in the seas. The DNA of organisms drifts in water. Fragments of fish, plankton, whale and algae wash invisibly throughout. Even without fossils, without bones, one could dip into the seas, and with patient analysis, read the record of things swimming and drifting nearby. The oceans remember us quite literally. Traces of human medicines, chemicals and waste travel in their depths. Long after we are gone, perhaps even long after the continents freeze or drown, the altered chemistry of the seas will mark our moment with exquisite clarity. In salt water, our echo is already secured. But what of a world where rotation has ended? Water no longer redistributed evenly across the globe would push poleward, settling into fewer, strangely arranged basins. Ocean currents, which rely on rotation to curve and power themselves, would wither or collapse entirely. The great conveyor belt that circulates heat from tropics to poles, stirring nutrients through depths, would falter. What happens to a memory when circulation ceases? When the endless mixing stills, when currents no longer stir the page but let it sink, line by line, into unmoving layers? Perhaps oceans without spin would become like stagnant pools of history, layering sharply, preserving locally but forgetting globally. Memory would persist, but it would lose its breath, becoming less of a chorus and more of a sealed chamber. Entropy, in water, often takes the form of dispersal pollutants, spreading, salts balancing, temperatures evening. But in this still planet, entropy's flow may slow. On the light side, oceans might evaporate, rising into pillars of storm that never move, then falling as endless rain over the same lands, etching a story of permanent flood. On the night side, seas would freeze into shelves, kilometers thick, salt trapped within ice, like punctuation marks in deep silence. Each part of the ocean would write its archive differently. Frozen lines of salt on one side, dissolved loops of heat and rain on the other. The planet's memory, once fluid, would fracture into hemispheres. Is it possible that the oceans themselves are Earth's consciousness, a distributed awareness not like ours, but made of diffusion and circulation? If so, how would that consciousness change when circulation ended? Would the Earth, robbed of spin, discover a new kind of thought, still, cold, fractured into two great hemispheres of memory never again mingled? Could oceans, in their silence, become divided minds of a single body? And yet, we must return to wonder. Even now, before any stillness, oceans carry stories we barely know how to read. Currents flow invisibly beneath surfaces. Nutrients rise in upwellings that sustain life too small for our eyes. And the quiet seafloor receives a steady rain of biological dust that will compact, harden, and speak millions of years from now. Every fragment finds its place. Every whisper drifts into the whole. Perhaps the truest memory of Earth has always been liquid, salted, restless, yet strangely permanent in its ability to carry fragments forward. If the seas could speak aloud, would they remind us not only of who we are but of who lived before us? Species erased but still floating in traces, dissolved forever in brine, would they hum back to us the vanished reefs, the ice ages, the great extinctions they have endured? And, if given time enough, will they also hum with the memory of us, our plastics, our carbon, our brief age floating amid their tides? And so we are left, listening to the thought the planet remembers in stone. Yes, but it also remembers in water. And if water itself is memory in motion, what then might be drawn upon the map of continents, redrawn and erased again, when seas choose not only to reveal but to rewrite? And so, if the oceans hold memory in their depths, they also hold the brush that redraws the continents. For when waters abandon their equatorial basins and pour toward the poles, the familiar shapes we cling to, those fragile outlines we call home, begin to dissolve. The maps that guided us across centuries, the lines of coast and bay etched into story and song, would lose their truth. A still Earth would ask us to watch geography itself, forget its own face. Africa, as we know it, might retreat beneath rising polar seas, its deserts partially swallowed, its coastlines reimagined. Asia might fracture into smaller fragments as flatlands vanished underwater, its heartlands split into shallow seas. The Americas, stretched and altered, might become a tapering string of islands, their lowlands lost, their mountains protruding like skeletal bones from unfamiliar waters. Even Australia, steadfast, would appear whittled along its edges, reefs carved away, plains drowned in salt. Nothing would remain quite recognizable. Every continent would carry both familiarity and estrangement, as if looking at the reflection of a loved one distorted in ripples. A map is not only a tool, it is memory itself. It defines belonging, roots us in landscapes, teaches us where journeys end and where they begin. What happens then, when those anchors are rearranged, when coastlines slide away, when old river mouths are swallowed, when mountains become coastlines and cities sink beneath brackish waves? We might cling to names, still calling drowned valleys by their old syllables, but the Earth will not remember those names. It will write new ones in stone and tide. Geologically, we know this has happened before. During the Ice Ages, oceans shrank into frozen vaults. Asia and America were joined by wide land bridges. Islands were continents, continents were larger. Then the melt came, pushing seas 100 meters higher. Rivers drowned, civilizations emerging, after that time were born into landscapes already rewritten. To Earth, there is nothing strange about such forgetting. To us, it is loss. Still, there would be thresholds of recognition. A pattern half familiar. Mountains tend to endure, ridges remain, volcanoes rise, highlands resurface. But even so, the ways in which land is surrounded, reshaped, fragmented, make the world feel less like the cradle we know, and more like some other planet entirely. Perhaps we would look at maps and feel like exiles, wandering across lands that bear our history, but no longer match our memory. And yet, there is poetry in erasure. To live in a map drawn anew is to accept impermanence, to recognize that home can be both lost and rediscovered. Forgotten coastlines whisper beneath the waves, but new coastlines are born, written along cliffs where waves now crash for the first time. Life does not refuse these changes. It migrates, adapts, settles into the unfamiliar. Perhaps people, if they remained, would learn to live in archipelagos, where cities once held ground, clinging to islands strung like beads across newborn seas. Perhaps deserts would shift into bays, forests into reefs, our migrations redrawn, not by choice but by necessity. But there is a deeper unease here. For every time Earth forgets and redraws, memory weakens. We measure ourselves by permanence, the location of a capital, the outline of a nation, the breadth of a desert. These points tether us. When they vanish, what remains of identity tethered to them? Would we recognize ourselves as the same species? Or would something within us slowly give way, fragmenting like shorelines themselves? And still, perhaps it is only our vanity that trembles, for the Earth has always erased and redrawn. Its maps are written not in ink but in water, and water keeps rewriting until no page is free of corrections. What we call continents are simply drafts, temporary arrangements of stone and sea. The forgetfulness of Earth may not be cruelty, but simply habit. And so, standing upon the new world carved by stillness, one might not only weep for drowned coastlines, but marvel also at what is revealed. Sea floors lifted, canyons drowned but mountains unburied, ruins turned into islands, fossils displayed in cliffs newly honed. We would be walking through both loss and revelation, carrying grief in one hand and wonder in the other. And yet, if oceans can redraw the map so mercilessly, if continents themselves can forget their ancient outlines, what then becomes of the skies above, those heavens where day and night were once our truest compass, but now may refuse us entirely? And yet, if oceans can redraw maps and continents surrender their outlines, we must turn to that other half of stillness, the land where night refuses to end. On this side of the unmoving earth, darkness becomes absolute, a permanent truth, a world where the sun becomes only a rumor told across generations. Here, time does not progress through sunrises or sunsets, it pools silently under stars that outlast every memory. To stand there is to feel eternity pressed close, unshifting, unwavering. At first, the human eye might marvel, to look upward into a sky that never changes, is to be carried into an illusion of permanence. The constellations would hang like carvings of light, etched against velvet, unmoving. The arc of the Milky Way would sprawl indefinitely, river of white scattering across space with no dawn to wash it away. Where once we saw stars only briefly each night, here they are companions, timeless and unyielding. Aurora Borealis and Aurora Australis might flare endlessly, rivers of green and violet searing across the still heavens, born from solar particles breaking against a magnetic field that, without rotation, may falter slowly but still lingers in ghostly sparks. The sky in such a place would be overwhelming, inexhaustible, too much to behold, too much to forget. But beneath the wonder lies cruelty. Within weeks and months, temperatures would plummet under the absence of sun, forests would first brown, then pale, then collapse, grasses frozen solid would crumble under frost. Oceans along this face would stiffen into ice sheets, kilometers deep, advancing across land like crystalline plains. Winds from the light side would scour this frozen night with ceaseless force, streaming ice and snow into deepening drifts. Entire regions would be encased in silence, muffled by frost. Unlike polar regions today, where light returns with patience after months, here there is no reprieve, only endless winter. Eternal night would be death for most that breathes warmth. And yet, not all would vanish. Life is cunning where time falters. Beneath seas now frozen, deep water vents would continue to glow. Hydrothermal chimneys might gather ecosystems around them. Bacteria feeding on minerals, blind creatures persisting in darkness as they have for 500 million years. Perhaps some fish would adapt to live within cracks of shifting ice, sensing faint traces of chemical warmth, evolving for a world that knows no dawn. The archives of ancient Earth remind us that extinction is never total. Even in catastrophe, persistence finds strange shapes. We can imagine, too, the stories that would rise from endless night. If people lingered here, clinging to geothermal heat or city domes powered by captured energy, their culture would become one shaped entirely by stars. Their songs would not mention sunrise, their myths might not contain words for morning. Instead, constellations would be gods, unblinking, eternal presences, never hidden beyond the horizon. Perhaps memory itself would grow sharper, since nothing interrupts the night to reset the mind. Dreams and waking might blend, the boundary between reality and vision growing porous. For what is sleep, untethered from day. What are lives, when measured, not by cycles of sun, but by endless streams of starlight? And within that unbroken darkness lies a more subtle force, the erasure of time as we understand it. On Earth as it is now, light gives us orientation. Even in caves, even in sleep, circadian rhythms pull at us. We sense the turn, the regularity of dawn and dusk, the sun's arc measuring the progress of days. Take that away, and the very axis of memory reshapes. Perhaps for those alive here, centuries would feel like one long continuous night, memory pooling together until boundaries grow vague. Perhaps identity itself would stretch thin, unable to measure itself in steady increments. Under eternal stars, life would not feel like a sequence, but like a single continuous dream. Yet, even in such dreamlike stasis, we would find paradox. For though the sky above is still, entropy continues its slow work. Ice spreads, rock cracks, pressure reshapes the land beneath the frozen seas. Fossilization continue beneath layers of snow, preserving bones within icy tombs. If night never ends, then preservation too may thrive. Carcasses kept intact for ages, stories sealed in ice like pages pressed flat in crystalline bindings. Eternal night might ironically become a keeper of memory, protecting fragments far longer than sunlight ever could. Still, inevitability hangs. The auroras, spectacular as they might be at first, would dim as Earth's rotationless core fails to nourish its magnetic veil. Once the dynamo stills, radiation from the sun would seep more directly, gnawing at skies, altering the very chemistry of air. Even the permanent darkness would not escape change. Silence would deepen, yes, but not safety. And so, we are left with an image both breathtaking and sorrowful, a hemisphere gazing forever into stars, its surface frozen, its seas solid, its creatures dwindling, its cultures writing myths of constellations and auroras, a place where night refuses to yield, and time becomes almost meaningless. But then, turn the sphere, and we see its mirror flooded, not with eternal silence but with endless blaze. For if one side is condemned to night without end, the other is consigned to a day that never sets, and there too, eternity makes and unmakes. And if one side of the still earth lies beneath eternal night, then the other is bound in the opposite spell, a sun that never moves, a day that never ends. Here the horizon has forgotten its role, and twilight has been erased from memory. There are no more dawns, no more dusks, no slow transitions filled with color, only the permanence of an unblinking star blazing overhead forever. At first glance, the sight itself would be dazzling. The warmth, the brilliance, the promise of light we once celebrated would at first feel abundant, unending, even generous. But generosity shifts into severity when it refuses to depart. For sunlight without pause is not a gift, it is a trial. Over weeks and months, soils would dry, rivers would shrink, forests would fade into brittle husks. As moisture flees upward into clouds, the sky would bruise into a permanent glare, clouds building but never wandering away, storms piling endlessly, without the rotation to disperse them. Rain might fall over the same land again and again until it drowned, while others baked into deserts harder than stone. The ecosystems we know would unravel quickly here. Plants, evolved to rest and recover beneath night, would be forced into frantic survival. Leaves would curl into armor against perpetual ultraviolet glare. Flowers, once timed to open and close with the sun's passage, would struggle in timeless exposure. Some life might attempt to adapt, succulent plants thickening into living reservoirs, roots pushing deeper toward groundwater, but most would wither. Without night, photosynthesis itself risks imbalance, the constant barrage of energy outpacing the machinery of life. Even our crops, the foundation of our civilization, would fail. Wheat that once sought the turning sun would crisp into brittle grass. Rice paddies would evaporate. Maize would cook in its husks. The breadbasket of humanity would become a kiln. Animals, too, would falter. Diurnal rhythms broken. Their bodies would not find rest. Eyes would sear against glare. Fur would not protect against heat, merciless impermanence. Herds might collapse. Insects vanish beneath sterilizing light. Some creatures would shift into burrowers, carving passageways beneath the earth to avoid a sky that has become unbearable. Perhaps the echo of twilight would survive here, not above ground but below, subterranean zones where cycles could be mimicked, darkness still allowed to cradle sleep. And then we must imagine ourselves. What becomes of human identity beneath an eternal sun? At first perhaps technology would help. Thick walls, cooled shelters, filters layered against ultraviolet light. Cities might burrow, as animals do, into the ground, carving entire civilizations in shadow. But psychologically, the loss of night would cut deeply, for our minds are braided into day and night, into the promise that light will ebb and darkness will soothe. Without it, our interior rhythms fracture. Sleep becomes fragile, dreams fractured, memory slurred. We lose track not only of hours but of ourselves in them. The endless light would become a disorienting fog, a white cage that blurs the edges of thought. But permanence carries paradox. Where one thing breaks, another may thrive. Permanent light might stir new life, organisms that worship sunlight, absorbing its gift in ways unfamiliar to us. Extremophile bacteria could bloom in soils sterilized to others. Algae and plankton, tuned to the blaze, could thicken seas with strange luminous scums feeding food webs alien to our memory. Life does not end uniformly, it transforms. An endless day is not only catastrophe but also cradle, a harsh womb preparing creatures strange to us, yet authentic to that world. And in culture too, new myths would rise, where endless night birthed star gods and auroras as eternal witnesses. The bright side would raise sun as tyrant and deity both. Perhaps rituals would focus on shadow, elevating shade as sacred, darkness, a rare and holy retreat. Whole mythologies might grow around caves, beneath canopies, around rare moments when deep valleys or eclipses offer relief. We might no longer praise the sun for rising, we might plead with it for rest. And still, the paradox cuts deeper. For while endless night preserves in ice, endless day erases. Fossils crumble, bones bleach, ruins collapse in accelerated weathering, nothing preserved under blazing constancy. Here, entropy speaks in rapid forgetting, where stone softens into sand and memory turns to dust. If eternal night holds secrets frozen in clarity, eternal day carries secrets into dissolution, scattering them in radiant silence. And in between, the twilight belt, lies perhaps the narrow ring where humans would cling to survival, caught between dark and blaze, a band where the sun forever hovers low on the horizon, casting the land in endless amber. There, crops might still grow in balance, warmth and cool shared gently. There, civilizations might cling like moss along the seam of an old stone. That narrow corridor, that fragile in-between, could become Earth's last refuge, the last memory of balance when the planet itself has erased the rhythm of turning. Eternal day, eternal night. Two mirrors of forgetting, two extremes of presence and absence. The world stilled, not dead but estranged, carrying new dreams, new adaptations, new myths. And as we contemplate this world locked in extremes, a question rises naturally: if the very skies above us twist beyond recognition, if night and day can be lost, what happens to the ancient companions of our navigation, the stars themselves, drifting slowly in altered arcs above a world that no longer spins? And yet, if one half of Earth gazes forever at the sun while the other drifts beneath endless night, we must ask, what becomes of the stars? For though they remain suspended in their ancient arcs, our relationship to them fractures the moment the Earth stops its turning. The steady wheel of constellations across the sky, the rhythm that guided both shepherd and sailor, would vanish. Stars would no longer rise, they would no longer set, they would simply remain, pinned into place, like forgotten compasses in a sky without movement. On the night side, this stillness would be overwhelming, where once the constellations drifted gently across the dome, marking seasons as they slid along horizons, they are now locked motionless. Orion no longer climbs or fades, the Big Dipper no longer circles the pole star itself would cease to serve as anchor. Instead, the entire firmament would stare back eternally, as though painted rather than alive. For those staring up, time would feel fractured. Without motion in the heavens, there is no measure of hours passing, no unfolding of direction. The stars are present, but they no longer guide. Ancient civilizations looked to the heavens for orientation, navigation, prophecy. They read in the constancy of motion, the patterns they mirrored in ritual and life. Without the turning earth, without the wheeling sky, this language dissolves. The navigational songs of Polynesian voyagers, charting ocean swells by star paths, would have no foundation. Our calendars, bound to solstices, would break. The signal of change, the slow drift of constellations across nights and seasons, the tilt of equinoxes, the cycles that once defined identity would erase. The heavens would still be filled with stars, but stars stripped of guidance, stripped of voice. On the day side, things are stranger still. Here, the stars vanish entirely, smothered by the unyielding gaze of the sun. For half the planet, space itself becomes unreachable, erased in brightness. Eternity, here, is not filled with stars but with their absence. To live under eternal daylight is to forget the cosmos exists, to forget the deep perspective the night sky always gave. Civilization might turn inward in such places, bound to the ground, the soil, the glare, no longer cradled by the heavens above. From a geologic sense, orientation also collapses. Animals that trust the stars for migration, birds, sea turtles, even insects would lose their compass. Migrations unravel, directions dissolve. Not only maps of coastlines, but celestial maps, those etched into DNA over millions of years, would fail. This is another kind of extinction, not the loss of body, but the loss of direction. Life disperses, not from lack of energy, but from lack of meaning in motion. And still, even in this stillness, we may imagine new myths rising. For if constellations stop drifting, whole cultures may learn to see permanence where once there was motion. A star frozen above might become a fixed god, eternal and unblinking, a celestial witness without departure. Perhaps religions here would praise immovability, steadfast skies that never betray, or perhaps they would ache with unease, feeling trapped beneath a dome that no longer turns, longing for the subtle reassurance of a sky in motion. Science tells us the stars themselves do move. Over tens of thousands of years, their proper motions shift, constellations distort, galactic orbits slowly curve, but without the Earth's spin, those motions would reveal themselves far more slowly than our lifespans can grasp. To us, the still sky would appear eternal, though deep time still carves its patient changes. This gap, between the stillness we perceive and the slow drifting beyond, would be another kind of forgetting. Perhaps the deepest question here is not whether the stars change, but whether we can live in a world without their change. For to see them pause is also to feel time itself hesitate. The familiar wheel of the heavens has always been a clock older than any tool, yet now the clock face is frozen. How would we learn to measure ourselves without the heavens marking our hours? Would we perhaps begin to seek time not in the sky, but in the Earth's very decay, erosion, entropy, the fall of ice, the movement of seas? The sky remains vast, eternal, incomprehensible. But without the turning Earth, its compass dissolves, its guidance silenced. The stars shine on, yes, but like forgotten instruments, mute reminders of the orientation we have lost. And yet, if the heavens above can fall silent, what of the hidden shield beneath our feet? For it is Earth's spinning core that stirs our magnetosphere, a shield that might vanish with stillness, exposing this frozen and burning world to the raw breath of the sun. And yet, if the stars remain as forgotten compasses, fixed and mute above a motionless Earth, another silence begins to stir, not in the sky's stillness, but in the unseen shield that has always held us safe. For wrapped around our planet is a magnetic veil, a cloak born of motion within the molten heart of Earth. It is this geomagnetic field that wards off the sun's furious winds, that bends cosmic particles away, that has protected our atmosphere from being stripped bare. And what happens to this veil when the Earth forgets how to spin? At the center of our planet, a solid iron core floats within molten iron that churns and circulates like a restless sea. That circulation, stirred by heat and by rotation, generates Earth's dynamo, a self-sustaining engine of magnetism. It is an invisible force we never notice, except in small things: compass needles, auroras rippling at polar skies, migrating birds trusting directions we cannot see. And yet it is this field that allows us to breathe, to flourish, to exist as fragile creatures unscorched beneath the sun. But with spin removed, the dynamo begins to falter. Circulation in the core slows. Heat still flows outward, yes, but without the rotational guidance that shapes complex currents, turbulence may fade into sluggish eddies. The generator weakens. The lines of force that once looped outward into space, curling into familiar north and south poles, begin to unravel. For years, for centuries perhaps, some ghost of magnetism might persist. But over time, the veil thins, patches open, and the planet grows naked beneath space's unrelenting breath. At first it would be imperceptible, a soft weakening no one feels. Compasses wander, uncertain. Auroras blaze with abnormal ferocity, as stray solar winds punch glowing holes into sky. Satellites flicker with surges of radiation. Radios crackle with noisy interference. Slowly the protective veil tears further. The magnetosphere that has always shielded us dwindles to a pale shadow, until only faint strands remain. And then comes the sun. Its winds, unbent, race directly into our skies. Stripped of our magnetic cloak, the upper atmosphere begins to erode. Hydrogen, the lightest element, flees first, blown outward into space. Oxygen follows in slower trickles. The airy ocean that cradles our lungs begins to thin. It would not go quickly, centuries might pass. But with no defense, the story we know from other worlds returns here. Mars, long ago, may have had oceans and rivers, but once its small dynamo ceased, the solar wind stripped its skies into absence, and water leapt away, frozen or vanished. A still Earth might follow, drawing closer to that same barren fate. And if air thins, how many echoes vanish with it? Auroras would flare brighter as they die, enormous green curtains shimmering above continents permanently locked in dusk. But as the atmosphere drains, those curtains fade forever, leaving a dark sky pierced sharper by radiation. Memory too would fail, as cosmic rays scrambled DNA, mutating what life remained, eroding delicate chains of inheritance. As the magnetic veil dissolves, the continuity of one species to the next would fray. We would not simply lose air, we would lose ancestry, lost in generations to noise. And yet entropy teaches us that nothing is erased without becoming something else. The collapse of the magnetosphere would also write a new archive in stone. Isotopes altered by cosmic rays sink into soils, recording the slow decay of the shield, line after line, etched invisibly into rocks. Whole mountain slopes might one day reveal the signature of radiation storms spread across centuries. Even as the shield fails, Earth still remembers, in new languages inscribed in minerals, lunar-style scars painted onto bare ground where auroras once danced. But questions curl at the edges of this imagining. Could some forms of life endure without the shield? Extremophiles, already tolerant of radiation, might thrive. In oceans still deep and shadowed, life might continue untroubled by skies they never saw. Buried beneath rock, fungi and microbes might find ways to weave energy from radiation itself, evolving into beings that not only endure the collapse of the field but feed upon it. Perhaps in some distant epoch, Earth would be inhabited, not by surface life, but by cavernous ecologies thriving on what once seemed only destruction. For us, however, creatures devoted to air and sun, the loss of the magnetosphere feels like abandonment, as though the Earth has dropped its shielding mantle and left us open to the universe unguarded, exposed to a cosmic truth we cannot withstand. Entropy keeps its patience, but exposure keeps no mercy. We return, then, to humility. The sky we thought permanent, the air we assumed eternal, these were always gifts of motion beneath us, of spinning metal hidden in the dark. Without spin, without motion, we lose not simply the rhythm of days and nights, not simply the spirals of wind and water, but the planet's breath of protection itself. And yet, when this shield falters and entropy claims the skies, another thought lingers like a whisper. If our atmosphere erodes into silence, then the surface of Earth becomes the marker of our extinction. Will the fossils that remain tell of the suddenness of shield's collapse? Will the stones write of the veiled protection that once was? Will the absence itself become the deepest echo? And yet, if the sky erodes, if the shield of magnetism falls away and the breath of air thins into space, the ground below begins to take on a greater weight. For when the atmosphere retreats, when the surface falters, the Earth itself becomes the witness. Stone, sediment, dust, these are the final pages on which catastrophe inscribes itself. In this still and wounded world, the planet would turn our age into a horizon, a thin layer etched into its crust, the fossil horizon of our time. Every epoch has its horizon. The dinosaurs speak from one written in clay and iridium, the boundary of an asteroid's violence. Ice ages leave their lines in tills and moraines, glaciers carving signatures into stone. The Carboniferous swamps left their memory in seams of coal, entire forests pressed into blackness, and we too will be written, perhaps already are being written, in sediments of plastic, concrete, isotopes, and restless carbon shuffled into every corner of the biosphere. The halt of Earth's spin would mark us still more sharply, a sudden change so decisive it would cut like a scar across the record. Imagine a far future geologist, human, or perhaps not, drilling a core through layers of stone. First there are chalks of vanished seas, then clays darkened with iron, then fossil shells echoing old coastlines, and then, abruptly, they strike our layer, a stratum littered with technofossils, plastic glomerates, fused metals, shards of glass melted into mineral, isotopic signatures of a climate suddenly thrown into chaos, a chemical marker of radionuclides released into skies and seas. Then, woven tight to all these, a pattern of burial cities drowned beneath the rushed oceans, their skeletons of steel and concrete hardened under pressure. One horizon, thin yet unmistakable, our presence etched into eternity. For though we think of fossils as bones, fossils are not only biology, they are memory itself, pressed into stone, a footprint in volcanic ash, a fern leaf printed in shale, a ripple mark preserved in petrified mud. These are fossils too, and our time will leave its footprint. The outlines of highways traced like veins in bedrock, the stumps of towers compressed into pale ridges, the ghostly impressions of machines hardened into rock. These will be our fossils, not only us, but the strange shapes of the world we built, then lost. Yet fossils do not only preserve, they erase. What fossilizes is always the exception. The vast majority of life dissolves unrecorded, swept away by entropy and chance. For every city that fossilizes, countless others will vanish without trace. For every artifact that endures, countless stories, names, faces will scatter into silence. The fossil horizon of our time would be fragmented, partial, stammering, much like the records of ages before. For Earth does not catalogue with fairness. It remembers with indifference. Memory and forgetting walk hand in hand. There is humility in this. Perhaps the most enduring record of our presence will not be the books we have written, nor the voices stored in magnetic fields and wires, but the accidental chemistry of our moment. A thin scattering of isotopes, an unfamiliar mineral seam, a spike of carbon frozen into shells of plankton. To a reader millions of years from now, this will be enough to know we were here, and yet it will not be enough to know who we were. The nuance, the texture, the laughter, the grief, all will be lost. Just as trilobites are remembered only as ridges, we too will be translated into form without soul. And this is what makes horizons both haunting and beautiful. They are moments of ending, marked so starkly in stone, but also beginnings. Above the dinosaur line, mammals flourish. Above coal seams, new forests grow. Above our horizon, something else, perhaps not us, but born of what we leave behind. The fossil horizon of our time will speak not only of our extinction, but of the possible life that may root itself in our absence. So perhaps the dignity lies not in permanence, but in realization that even stillness, even collapse, even erasure, feeds the memory of a planet that never stops recording. We are no more permanent than the ammonite or the fern, but like them we too will leave a whisper in stone. And yet, whispers pile, fossils accumulate, horizons stack one upon another, eras pressed like pages turned. So as we imagine our own thin layer, preserved or half erased, we must also wonder what happens when so many layers of silence and loss accumulate, until even memory itself takes on a different shape. What becomes not of fossils, but of absence itself? And yet, if every fossil layer is only a fragment, if every memory kept in stone or water is only partial, we arrive at a softer and stranger horizon, the horizon of absence itself. For the still earth would not only preserve some fragments of us, it would also erase most. It would silence more than it keeps. And so the question becomes less about what remains, and more about the shape of what is gone. Absence is not nothingness. It is a presence of its own kind, a shadow that tells us what light once was. If we walk across a dry riverbed, the rocks tell not only of the water that once flowed, but of its absence now. If we see the imprint of a leaf in shale, we grasp not only the shape of the leaf, but its silence. The same would be true on a motionless earth. Drowned coastlines, frozen plains, cities crumbled beneath ice or scorched beneath perpetual sun. All of these are absences, marked into the fabric of the planet. They speak, but in hushed tones, telling us primarily what is no longer here. Consider the sound of the winds we imagined earlier, rushing in straight lines when curvature failed. In time they too would fall quiet. The atmosphere thinning, dispersing, its power weakening. The silence afterward would not be empty. It would hum with the loss of what once was. The forests felled in endless daylight. The flowers never blossomed in night. The migrations cut short in skies without stars. All absent, yet shaping the still earth like unseen hands. Absence is in its own way a kind of memory. The gaps between notes define the music. The spaces between fossils define the horizon. The centuries of forgetting make the few fragments left behind that much sharper. Perhaps humanity itself is more likely to be remembered in this way, not in the traces we leave, but in the giant silences that follow us. Gaps in ecological richness, sudden voids in geological continuity. A planet who once full of spirals, dances and migrations falls into bluntness. The difference would be felt as absence, that hollow carved by our vanishing. And there is tenderness here too. For we know absence intimately, in forgetting names, in losing loved ones, in watching rivers dry, in dreaming of people we can no longer hold. We already live alongside it. To scale this familiar grief to a planetary level is to imagine what the Earth, still and silent, would carry within itself, not merely records of presence, but a profound chorus of absences, eradicated rhythms, vanished spirals, time itself unmeasured, dissolved into endless night and endless day. But, let us ask, could absence itself become a presence so profound it gives birth to something new? If continents redraw, if memory is fractured, if ruin is exposed only to crumble again, perhaps what arises is not the despair of loss, but the beginnings of another rhythm. Just as silence in music is not emptiness, but the ground from which sound is born, absence in the earth might become fertile, generative. Life, reshaped under duress, would right itself in the margins. Absence leaves behind. Perhaps whole new ecosystems would evolve along the twilight belts. Perhaps in endless night, glowing organisms would bloom beneath ice, singing softly to fill the void. Perhaps in endless day, strange resilient plants would root themselves into the blaze, inventing new ways to carry out the work of light. Absence, paradoxically, carries possibility. And for us, or for whoever follows us, absence also asks humility. For what we remember most vividly in personal life are not only presences, but the forms absence carved inside us, the echo of a voice never heard again, the shape of a house left behind, the gap in a photograph where someone should have stood. Our own memories are already fossils of absence. So it may be with the earth, what defines it in the end is not only what it keeps, but what it has let scatter away into silence. A still earth would be an earth sculpted by absence. The absence of spin, the absence of storms in spirals, the absence of days and nights, the absence of migrations, rivers' curves, the Coriolis hum we never heard. And in all these vanished motions, the planet would reshape itself into something slower, stranger, perhaps less familiar, but still itself. Perhaps this is what absence ultimately teaches, that identity is not only what remains, but also what has been lost along the way. And so we come to rest here, at this final question: what, in the end, is truly permanent? Rivers forget their courses. Civilizations drown. Fossils fracture. Even stars shift slowly, despite their appearance of eternity. Nothing holds absolutely. Perhaps permanence exists only in absence itself, in the quiet space that everything eventually leaves behind. And yet, what if this absence is not frightening, but soothing? Not an abyss, but a pillow for memory to rest upon. For when eyes close at the end of the day, what greets us is not presence, not detail, not continuity, but absence, the deep, soft unraveling of thought into sleep. And maybe, just maybe, the still earth carries that same invitation, not to despair at what is gone, but to lean into the silence, to find rest inside the shape of absence.